Greetings everyone. Today we'll see a problem and we'll try to solve that problem using PLC ladder logic diagrams. Now let's see the problem first. Here we are asked to prepare a program in which sensor will sense 3 consecutive parts on the conveyor and 3 cylinders will push those 3 parts respectively to the bin. Here we can see a diagram of the setup. I'm going to explain this diagram in the next slide. Since nothing is specified in the problem, we will assume the conveyor will start running after we press this green button, which is denoted as P0. After we press it, the conveyor P42 will start running and it will continue to run until we press this red button, which is denoted as P01. Now, if I put an object on this conveyor, it will start to move forward. At a point, it will get sensed by this sensor, which is P02. After it is sensed, it will eventually reach in front of the first cylinder, that is denoted as P46. When it reaches in front of this cylinder will stick out and push this object to the bin. And after that, the cylinder will return to its initial position. Now if we place a second object on this conveyor belt, it will get sensed by the sensor P2 and eventually it will reach in front of the cylinder P45, which is the second cylinder in this setup. And then this cylinder will push that object to this bin. And lastly, if we put a third object, it will travel in front of the third cylinder, which is P44, and it will get pushed to the bin. Now, if we place another object, this cycle will repeat itself. Before we can solve this problem, we need to make some certain assumptions. The assumptions are: after an object is sensed by the sensor P02, which is this one, it takes the object 3.5 seconds to reach the first cylinder, which is this one, the P46, 4.5 seconds to reach the second cylinder, which is this one here, the P45, and finally 5.5 seconds to reach the third cylinder, which is the leftmost one, the P44. Now we will see the ladder logic diagram to solve this problem. So let's move on to the diagram now. This is the ladder logic diagram of the given problem. I'm going to explain all the steps of this diagram now. As soon as this program is downloaded, all the close contacts across the ladder logic diagram will receive signal except for the sensors P2 as they act differently. So let me denote it with a highlighter. Here P1, C1, T2, C1 here, T4, C2, and T6 will receive signal by default. Now we have a push button, the green button, which is denoted as P0. If we push it, it will receive signal and P42 will also receive signal. As a result, the conveyor will start running. Now even we release the green button, due to latching, P42 will not be deactivated and it will keep running. As soon as P42 receives the signal here, all the P42s across this diagram will receive signal and will be activated. Now, if we put an object onto the conveyor belt, it will start moving forward and at the point it will get sensed by the sensor P2. So P2 across this ladder logic diagram will receive signal. As soon as P2 receives signal, this counter C1 will count to 1. This counter C2 will also count to 1. Whenever P2 receives signal, if we look at this rung, M1 receives the signal and T1 starts to receive a continuous signal. After some point, the object will move past the sensor and the sensor will lose its signal. So all the P2 in this diagram is going to be deactivated. But in case of this rung, since we used latching here, T1 will continue to receive the signal. And after a certain period of time, which is 3.5 seconds, T1 will get activated and it will activate the cylinder P46. Now if you remember, we assumed whenever an object, the first object basically, is sensed by the sensor P2, it takes the object 3.5 seconds to reach the first cylinder. So it means after 3.5 seconds, the object will be pushed by the first cylinder into the bin. Now whenever T1 is activated, the timer T2 starts receiving a continuous signal, and after 1.5 seconds, T2 will be activated. As soon as T2 is activated, the close contact for T2 here will lose its signal. Whenever T2 loses the signal, M1 also loses the signal. T1 loses the signal and P46 becomes deactivated. It means the cylinder, after pushing the first object, it will get back to its initial position. When T1 is deactivated, the timer T2 stops receiving the signal, and as a result T2 becomes deactivated as well. It means the close contact for T2 will regain its signal. Now if we put another object, the second object, onto the conveyor belt, after a certain period it will get sensed by the sensor P2, and like before, all the P2 across this ladder logic diagram will receive signal. Whenever P2 receives signal here, this counter will count to 2. This counter will also count to 2. Now if we look at here, in this counter, the initial count we set was 2. So the C1 will be activated and hence it will receive signal. Whenever C1 is activated, the close contacts for C1 all across the ladder logic diagram will lose the signal. Now if we look at this rung, M2 will receive the signal and T3 will start receiving a continuous signal. If we look at this rung, since C1 is deactivated, the close contact of C1 is deactivated, the timer T1 will not receive any signal and hence this whole rung will keep deactivated. Now as like before, after some time object will get past the sensor P2 and all the P2s across this ladder logic diagram will be deactivated. Let me quickly denote that. Now if you look at this rung, since we used latching, this rung will be activated and T3 will not stop receiving the signal. And after 4.5 seconds, T3 will be activated and hence P45 will also get activated. It means when the second object is sensed by the sensor P2, after 4.5 seconds it will get pushed to the bin by the second cylinder, which is P45. Now since T3 is activated, the timer T4 will also start receiving a continuous signal, and after a certain time, that is 1.5 seconds, T4 will be activated. And whenever T4 is activated, the close contact for T4 here will lose the signal. As a result, M2 will lose the signal, and whenever this happens, T3 will also stop receiving the signal. So T3 will become deactivated and it will deactivate the cylinder P45, which means the cylinder will get back to its original position, and whenever T3 is deactivated, the timer T4 will also be deactivated, and hence the close contact for T4 here will receive the signal once again. Now if we put the third object on the conveyor belt, like before, it will get sensed by the sensor P2 and it will make all the P2 across the ladder logic diagram active. Whenever this P2 is active, the counter will count to 3. As the initial set count is also set as 3, this C2 will become activated. Whenever this C2 is activated, the close contact for C2 will lose the signal. Now if we look at this rung, since close contact for C2 is deactivated, the timer T3 will not receive the signal, and hence this portion will remain deactivated. And also in this rung, since close contact for C1 is deactivated, this portion will also keep as deactivated. Now in this rung, we can see the timer T5 will start receiving a continuous signal, and after 5.5 seconds T5 will get activated and it will activate P44, which is the third or the leftmost cylinder. It means when the third object is sensed by the sensor P2, after traveling 5.5 seconds, it will get pushed to the bin by the cylinder P44. Now, as like before, since T5 is activated, the timer T6 will start receiving a continuous signal, and after 1.5 seconds, T6 will be activated. As a result, the close contact for T6 will lose the signal. Hence, T5 will lose signal and become deactivated. It will make the cylinder P44 deactivated, and P44 will get back to its initial position. Now, since T6 is activated, here and here, T6 will start receiving signal and it will be activated. Now, if we look at this counter, T6 is the reset button of this counter. So, this counter, the count of this counter will reset and it will be reset to 0. Whenever the count is reset to 0, the open contact for C1 will lose the signal. Whenever C1 loses the signal, the close contact for C1 will start receiving the signal. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, like before, after a certain time, object will pass the sensor and so P2 will be deactivated all across the ladder logic diagram. Now, if we look at the counter C2, T6 is also the reset button of this counter, so it will reset the count to 0. Whenever the count is reset, C2, the open contact for C2 will lose the signal, and whenever the open contact for C2 loses the signal, the close contact of C2 will start receiving signal. Now, since T5 is deactivated, timer T6 will also stop receiving the signal and it will be deactivated as well. As a result, this T6 and this T6 will lose the signal, and the close contact for T6 here will receive the signal. Now, if you closely look at this diagram, it is the same when we first pushed the green button to start the conveyor. So we can understand, if we are to put another object, this process will repeat itself in a cycle. Now we can push the red button, which is P1, to stop the conveyor from running. If we push the red button, this P1 here will lose its signal, so all the P2 across the ladder logic diagram will also be deactivated. Now when we release the button, P1 will gain signal once again, but P42 will remain deactivated. Now let's think of an interesting scenario. Let's say we have pressed the green button to run the conveyor. So like before, all the P42s are running and getting the signal. Now let's say we have put an object onto the conveyor belt, and it will eventually get sensed by the sensor P2, and it will get pushed by the first cylinder as we saw before. What if we decide to stop this setup by pushing the red button and we resume it after some time? Now, if we put another object on this conveyor belt, what will happen? Will it be pushed to the bin by the second cylinder, or the process will repeat itself? So let's work this out. Suppose we have put one object onto the bin and it will get sensed by the sensor P2. I will quickly go through. Okay, all the P2 across the ladder logic diagram will receive the signal. This counter will count to 1. This counter will also count to 1. Here M1 will receive the signal, and the timer T1 will start receiving a continuous signal. Obviously, after some time, all the P2 will lose the signal, but it will keep the timer T1 running, and after 3.5 seconds, T1 will be activated. It will activate the cylinder P46. The first object will get pushed to the bin by the first cylinder, and after 1.5 seconds, T2 will get activated. It will make the close contact of T2 deactivated. As a result, M1, T1, P46 will be deactivated. Hence, T1 is deactivated. T2 will also be deactivated, and the close contact for T2 will receive signal. Now, let's say we have decided to stop the conveyor belt at this moment. So we have pushed this red button, so P1 will lose the signal. Now all the P42 across this diagram will stop receiving signal. When you release the button P1, it will gain the signal once again, but P42, the conveyor belt, won't gain the signal. Now, if we look at this ladder logic diagram, the conveyor P42 is not the reset button for the counters. For both C1 and C2, it is not the reset button. So, stopping it will not have any effect on the counter. So, whenever we resume the conveyor, the object put on it will behave like as it would if we had kept the conveyor running continuously. So, let's see if that's the case or not. So, we have started the conveyor once again after some time. So all the P42s will receive signal. Here P0 will lose the signal after we release the green button. Now if we put one object on the conveyor belt, it will eventually get sensed by the sensor P2. Whenever sensor P2 is activated, this counter will count to 2. Like before, this counter will also count to 2. Since it counts to 2, C1, the open contact for C1 gets activated, the closed contact for C1 gets deactivated, M2 gets activated, so T3 starts receiving a continuous signal. Obviously T2 will lose the signal after some time, but T3 will continue to receive the signal, and after some time, which is 4.5 seconds, T3 is activated, T45 is activated, and the object is pushed by the second cylinder as we have expected. So, even if we decide to stop the conveyor belt after sensing one or two objects, the sequence will not break when we resume it. In this program, we can see another thing. We have P42 in series connection in these 3 runs. As a result, when the conveyor is shut off, P42 will not receive the signal. As a result, if we sense an object by the sensor at this point, the timer will not receive the signal. If we did not have P42 in series connection, even if the conveyor was off, the timer would have activated whenever an object is sensed by the sensor P2. So this was the ladder logic diagram and the explanation of the diagram of our given problem. Thank you so much for watching.